Gaius Duilius, Consul 260 BCE, Censor 258 BCE. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, when the Romans crossed into Sicily in alliance with the hard-pressed Greeks of the island in an attempt to eject the Carthaginians. While Roman land forces were doing well in advancing to the Carthaginian settlements in the west, the mountainous terrain of Sicily proved to be a gift to the outnumbered Carthaginians, who did not need to control open agricultural land to hold on to their coastal strongholds due to their naval dominance. This realization, combined with the strength of Punic landward fortifications, meant that the Romans would need a strong navy if they were to actually finish off the Carthaginians in Sicily and hope to land troops further afield. In 261, the Romans began to construct this fleet, and by 260, a fleet of 150 warships was ready to sail. The consuls for 260 were the patrician Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina and a plebeian named Gaius Duilius. Not much is known about Duilius' life before he achieved the consulship. The only fact that we know for certain is that he was a novus homo, the first man in his family to achieve high office. As such, Duilius had much more to prove than his patrician colleague Scipio. When lots were drawn to give the new consuls their assignment for the year, Duilius won command of the army. It is hard to know what the two consuls were hoping for when it came to the results of the lot. Naval command was a novelty and must have been very exciting, but the risk of engaging the more seasoned Punic fleet must have been obvious. Rome's army, on the other hand, was a safe bet, as it had experienced great success up to this point, and Duilius could reasonably expect yet more success to come his way. Each path presented great opportunities, and both consuls may have secretly wished that it were possible for them to get a chance to win glory on both land and sea. Duilius left for Sicily and took command of the army, while Scipio prepared his fleet. When he first arrived in Sicily, the Greek city of Segesta, an important Roman ally, was under siege from a Carthaginian army. The Punic commander at Segesta was named Hamilcar, and he is not to be confused with Hamilcar Barca, who only emerged in the latter stages of the war. Duilius moved at once to the aid of the Segestans, and after 9 days of fighting he succeeded in lifting the siege. Later, Duilius advanced into Punic Sicily and won control of the city of Macella. The exact timeline for this campaign is unclear, since Polybius only records the events of each year in order without much further detail. However, it is probable that Duilius achieved these two things early and in rapid succession, since he still had time to take up a new command and spend some time at his new post. While Duilius was finding success on land, Scipio had been blockaded at Lipara and forced to surrender along with the 17 ships of his advance force. When the remainder of the new Roman fleet arrived, numbering some 130 ships, they reported to Messana. At that juncture, Duilius relinquished command of the army over to his legates and joined the fleet to command as consul. As a senior official in the Roman hierarchy, it only made sense that such an expensive asset such as the fleet should be under a commander who was currently invested with the most authority of any Roman, and who was fresh off of a pair of significant successes. However, it is worth noting that even in the absence of both Scipio and Duilius, that the Roman fleet had already engaged with the main Carthaginian fleet under its admiral Hannibal Gisco, and won a substantial victory while it was en route to Messana. After his initial success against Scipio's squadron, it appears that Hannibal Gisco became overconfident and perhaps thought that the Romans would be demoralized in the absence of the jackass. At a place that Polybius called the Cape of Italy, and which is probably to be identified with the modern Cape Vaticano, the consulless Roman fleet encountered Hannibal's fleet and defeated the Punic ships decisively, supposedly capturing or sinking 50 vessels, although I am somewhat skeptical of the numbers being anywhere near that high. Not only did the Romans win a significant clash without a high-ranking commander, but they won this battle without the aid of the corvus, the most famous Roman weapon from the First Punic War. One of the myths about the First Punic War is that the Romans had no seafaring experience whatsoever, and that they made up for this with the corvus, which was a bridge that clamped down onto an enemy ship, fixed it in place, and allowed marines on the deck to board an enemy ship by storm. There are two fatal flaws with this view of naval battles during the war. First, the Romans actually had a small fleet dating back at least to the late 6th century, and given the number of coastal cities responsible for producing levies into Rome's legions, there were plenty of individuals with sailing experience. While the Carthaginians were almost undoubtedly more experienced at sea, the Romans were not the complete and total amateurs that they are often portrayed as, although it does appear that 260 was the first year during which a Roman fleet of such magnitude was assembled. The second fatal flaw to the Corvus narrative is that it is only explicitly mentioned as being employed in battle twice during the entire war, which featured a considerable number of naval battles. The battle for the Cape of Italy significantly includes no mention of the Corvus, and in fact our sources say that the Carthaginians were surprised to see the weapon make its debut in the next battle at Mylae. Hannibal Gisco's fleet was ravaging the territory around the city of Mylae on the north coast of Sicily when Duilius's fleet sailed up to give battle. Polybius tells us that the Carthaginian admiral had 130 vessels, but he does not give us a precise number for the Roman armada. It is possible that the Romans had only the 120 ships that Diodorus Siculus allots them for this engagement, since the Carthaginians sailed against them confidently. As the two fleets clashed, the Carthaginians took note of the strange instruments on the prows of the Roman vessels, and they do not seem to have been overly impressed or intimidated. However, they would be quickly disabused of their initial indifference toward the Corvus. When the two fleets clashed, the Carthaginians were stunned when 30 Roman vessels used their Corvus devices to clamp onto 30 Punic vessels and then overrun them. Adding to this initial confusion is that one of the 30 Carthaginian ships that met with this unexpected fate was Hannibal's ship, and he was forced to flee back to the rest of his fleet in a small boat. Fun side note, Hannibal's flagship at Mylae was a vessel that the Carthaginians had taken from Pyrrhus of Epirus, a famous and fierce enemy of both belligerents during the previous decade. Hannibal Gisco regrouped his remaining ships and they tried to outmaneuver the slower Roman ships, but they were thwarted by the surprising flexibility of the Corvus and Roman countermeasures. After losing a total of 50 ships, the Carthaginians were sufficiently shaken to call it a day and retreat to their base at Panormus. On the Roman side, Duilius lost only 11 ships. The Battle of Mylae had been an unambiguous Roman victory, and it was immediately recognized as one of the major milestones in the war, as it brought to an end Rome's fear of the Carthaginian fleet and opened up the possibility that Roman forces could strike much deeper into enemy territory than they had previously envisioned. In the direct aftermath of the battle, Polybius tells us that Duilius decided to forego pursuit of the Punic fleet and opted instead to land on Sicily and deposit all of his marines so that they could aid in the relief of Segesta. Since his ships were carrying legionaries serving as marines, the arrival of his fleet probably would have meant a significant influx of new manpower, as well as the arrival of good news and supplies. However, I prefer the sequence of events as given in Duilius's honorific post on his column, since that is more contemporary than Polybius's narrative history a century after the event. In either case, Hannibal Gisco won a minor land victory in Sicily before sailing with his men to Sardinia, which had been a Carthaginian stronghold for a couple centuries. In Sardinia, the hard-pressed Hannibal landed with his forces and presumably had gone there to both regroup and prevent a Roman landing on the island. Unfortunately for him, Roman ships from Duilius's fleet soon arrived at the harbor where Hannibal had just disembarked and blockaded the harbor. Polybius does not make clear whether or not Duilius was present for this action, but it seems fairly likely. At any rate, the Carthaginians with Hannibal Gisco were so enraged at his repeated failures that they decided to kill him according to the Punic custom, that is to say, by crucifixion. Duilius went home to Rome and celebrated the first triumph for a naval victory in Roman history. The triumphal procession included the rams from some of the Carthaginian ships that he had captured at Mylae. After starting the year as a novus homo, who probably could expect little more than to have his name recorded as the year's consul, who would get to fight a battle or two that might not end up mattering, Duilius became the only great Roman hero of the First Punic War, and a figure who would inspire future generations. The Romans thought so highly of Duilius' accomplishments that he received 2 war memorials. Both memorials took the form of columns featuring a ship's bronze ram, and both columns recounted Gaius Duilius' deeds on behalf of the Roman Senate and people. These 2 columns are unique in that they are the only war monuments commemorating naval battles from the Roman Republic. In addition, Duilius was accompanied by a flautist and someone bearing a waxen torch to light his way every evening for the rest of his life. It seems that this unusual accommodation was an official honor granted by the Senate, but it may well have been done on Duilius' own dime and simply left a strong enough impression that later generations assumed that it was a high honor granted by the Senate. In retrospect, the Battle of Mylae was hardly the end of Rome's struggle to secure naval dominance over Carthage, but it was the most important step, and as such, was one of the most important battles that Rome fought during a century which saw Rome complete the conquest of Italy, conquer Sicily, and fend off an invasion by Hannibal Barca a generation later. The Battle of Mylae broke Carthage's absolute domination of the sea. This victory set the stage for Rome's establishment of a dominant, permanent fleet, which allowed them to conquer the Mediterranean over the next couple of centuries. In 258 BCE, in his last known public office, Duilius received the very rare honor, for both a plebeian and especially a novus homo, of being elected as censor, along with Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the brother of his former consular colleague Scipio Asina, and also the grandfather of the famous Scipio Africanus. Duilius never held a high command in the field again, though that might just simply be because he was a novus homo, and novus homo members of the Senate tended to take longer to get to high office, so it may simply be the case that Duilius was too old to engage in further active service. While Gaius Duilius is not a household name to modern Roman history buffs, he was regarded as one of the most honorable Romans of all time, and a moral exemplar by later generations. In Book 1 of his Republic, Cicero uses Gaius Duilius as an example of a man who, not tainted by Epicureanism, was driven by his patriotic devotion to Rome to accomplish great deeds. This is a good example of how Romans looked back at the opinions and personal lives of great Romans when seeking examples for how to properly conduct themselves. Furthermore, it suggests that despite the poverty of our knowledge of Duilius' early life today, this information was almost certainly available in antiquity. Cicero, who was himself a novus homo, most likely mentioned Duilius not just for his fame, but for the fact that he was a novus homo whose career was untarnished by counterbalancing bad deeds, in contrast to the most famous novus homo of Cicero's youth, the controversial Gaius Marius.